Greetings and welcome. Thank you for coming to the third seminar in the Fall 2023 Science in the News seminar series. If you've never joined us before, the format of the talks is that they usually have 3 parts. In between each part, we'll pause for questions and possibly a short break. If you're joining us on the live stream, feel free to type your questions for the speaker into the chat at any point, and during those breaks, we will relay them to our speaker. So our speaker tonight is Sarah Radway, a PhD student in computer science here at Harvard. And tonight she'll be telling us about the politics of data privacy in the US Census.
Hi, thank you so much. So my name is Sarah, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my work, examining the policy surrounding data privacy in the US Census. So I thought a good place for us to start was just by defining exactly what US Census data is. And for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be focusing on decennial census data. And the decennial census is a census, it surveys the entire population of the United States, and it occurs every 10 years. And in the survey, they collect information about household size, and then for each member of the household, they collect information about their age, sex, and race. And there are numerous important use cases for the decennial census, one of which is in redistricting. So redistricting is the process by which both federal congressional seats are allocated and districts within states are drawn. And these processes are both very heavily ingrained in the democratic process in the United States, so they're very important. Another use case is in urban and financial planning. So census data helps determine how funds are allocated for government programs, for example, for SNAP and Medicaid. And it also helps determine where support is needed financially, so to set aside funds for things like housing assistance, or building hospitals, or supporting grocery stores in the community. And so the importance of these use cases means that the utility of census data is very important. Data utility represents its usefulness for a given task. So we can think about a program like SNAP, a food assistance program. If a community's data is underreported, then they're going to miss out on important funding opportunities. And missing out on these funding opportunities means serious consequences, like people losing out on funding for food. So more generally, inaccurate census data may lead to insufficient resource allocation. However, the privacy of census data is also very important. The data types collected in the census are sensitive and can have serious negative impact. For example, census data was used to identify Japanese people to be brought to internment camps in World War II. Additionally, studies have shown that participation rates are impacted by privacy concerns. So having accurate census data in turn means that more people will, or having private census data means that more people will in turn participate in the census, making it more accurate. Lastly, if the 2 previous arguments aren't compelling enough, Title 13 of US Code mandates that the Census Bureau has to de-identify data, so regardless of any other reasons, they have to do it anyways. And right now you may be thinking, so we live in a world of data availability, right? Why does census data merit all these additional protections? Can't I just go on Facebook and look and answer all these questions? But I think there's a few fundamental differences between data that's shared on Facebook and data that's shared by the Census Bureau about citizens. So sharing data on Facebook is a choice, right? And many people choose not to make that choice, and they also have control over who data is shared with and what data is shared on Facebook. Additionally, it's not always linkable to sensitive information. For example, data in the census such as race data or household size. Race data is as sensitive as we've discussed before, and household size can show things like tenants violating housing codes. So the data in the census is directly sensitive. Additionally, in many ways, the privacy settings of Facebook allow control, whereas you don't control those settings for the census. So government, in many ways, has more power than private industry to do damage as well. And the federal government, thus, is held to a higher standard than private industry for this reason. So therefore, when we're collecting and sharing census data, the Census Bureau really needs to be thinking about balancing data utility with data privacy. And ideally, we would want to have the highest level of privacy for participants and the highest level of utility for data users, right? However, unfortunately, that's not technically possible right now. There's a trade-off between privacy and utility, and we can't gain one without sacrificing the other. So we can only get like this, or this, or this. And this, oh no, my Siri is going off. Okay, so this trade-off varies between mechanisms balance between these is controlled by this thing called a parameter. And so you can think of a parameter as like a sliding scale that allows you to determine this trade-off between utility and privacy. And today we're going to be addressing these three topics surrounding the census's pursuit of de-identified data. Now that we have all that background information out of the way, we can get started with the first one, which is how the census de-identifies data. So the census has been de-identifying data for decades, and they've used numerous different methods along the way. And today we're going to focus on the two most modern ones: swapping, which was used in 2000 and 2010, and then differential privacy, which was used in 2020. So swapping, the method used in 2010, this method entails the exchange of data about households between groups. So for example, we can think about counties. So we can think about trying to make County B, for example, more private. And we see that all these households have different colors, right? We can think of these household colors as sensitive attributes. For example, race or gender or income. And so the first thing that a swapping mechanism does is it prioritizes unique entries. So this would mean that the red house, which is unique in County B, would be selected for swapping first. So once we picked the red house to be swapped, we would then pick a household to swap the red house with from another area. And to pick a house to swap with, the Census Bureau matches the household based upon household size and the people over and under voting age. So people over 18 and under 18. And this is done this way because the data is used for redistricting, so voting age individuals is pretty important. So in this case, we would pick someone from County A who also had 3 household members. So we can pick this blue house, for example. And we would swap those two. So the data about the red house would go to County A, and the data about the blue house would go to County B. And swapping is managed by this parameter called the swap rate. And the swap rate represents the proportion of data to be swapped. So this can range from 0 to 100%, or 0 to 1. And a higher swap rate represents lower accuracy and higher privacy. So we can think about if we swap more people out of this original County B, so if we get rid of more houses and add different houses in, the accuracy is going to be worse because we're changing the original data. However, the privacy is going to be higher because less of the original data is there, right? So a higher swap rate means lower accuracy, higher privacy, whereas a lower swap rate would be the opposite. So in the last couple decades, there's been a massive shift in data availability. And one way this is clearly visible is the rise of data brokers. So data brokers are organizations that amass data about individuals and sell it. They try to learn as much about individuals as possible and collect as much as they can. Like, for example, data such as name, gender, contact information, residential information, but also data like income information, location data, or relational data, or even purchase history. They're just trying to collect as much information as possible about individuals in order to sell that data, typically for advertising purposes. And all of this accessible outside data weakens privacy guarantees because it allows for linking identities to public data, so re-identifying people from data. So for example, we can say we're a company like Facebook or a data brokerage firm like Equifax, and we have all of this data on the left here from people's Facebook profiles. So we have all the data about people in County A. And by using publicly available census data, we can determine what color house some of these individuals have, right? Because if we know that there's only 2 males in the Facebook profile data and in the census data, and both of them in the census data live in blue houses, then we know that those 2 people, Bob and Charles, must have a blue house, right? And we can say with 50% chance that Alice or Diane have a respective color house. But all that to say that having this outside data weakens the ability of swapping to protect the privacy of people in census data datasets. So the Census Bureau recognized this threat and attempted to perform a similar attack to the one we just walked through, like before, but instead of Facebook, they used data from Experian. And in this attack, they tried to see how much of the original data set that they could recreate. And it ended up that 46% of entries, when reconstructed, were exact matches. So this represents about 150 million people having their data reconstructed. There has been significant controversy over these findings, however. Namely, there's been concern about what reconstruction really means. So whether reconstructing an accurate data set means that you've identified an individual. So There's a paper by Ruggles and Van Riper that suggests that most matches reported by the Census Bureau that were reported could have been random. So they never compared against a null model when they were doing these re-identifications. They never said how many people would randomly be re-identified if we did this attack. So they would argue that some percentage, probably a pretty large percentage of these, would have occurred randomly. And also we can raise the question of reconstruction versus re-identification. So whether it's the same thing to say that 45% of people's data was an exact match versus being able to say this is Alice's data, this is Bob's data, this is Cam's data. So there's some controversy surrounding the validity of this attack. However, given the results of it, the Census Bureau was concerned enough about their ability to provide sufficient privacy with swapping that they decided to move to a new method. And so the Census Bureau saw a new method to make data private. That's how they addressed this concern. But if we want to take a little break, I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. I'll take like a 10-second pause before I move on. You cool? All right, I'll keep going. So at this point, the Census Bureau sought to find a new method to make data private, and they turned to differential privacy. So differential privacy, the method used in 2020, is a little less immediately intuitive than swapping, but we're going to work our way through it. It's going to be fine, and I'm just going to provide you some general intuition for how differential privacy works. So to start, we can just think about this figure here on the right. So we take tabulated data, which is the sum of counts for each category. So for example, we have 1 red house, 4 yellow houses, and 5 blue houses. So we create like an aggregated table of all of those values. And we modify each row of these tables to make the data set private. And the way that we do this is by adding noise. So we're going to talk about this in a little more detail, but we're going to examine how the noise that's added is parameterized by this value epsilon. So epsilon changes how much noise is added. And then also, we have this privacy guarantee that comes with differential privacy, that changing one person's data will only change the re-identified data by a little bit, where a little bit also depends on this parameter value. To start off, I thought we would talk a little bit about what noise is. So we said differential privacy adds noise to a data set to make it private, right? But what does it mean to add noise to something? So some of you might know this already, and I'm sorry if that's the case, but I think the most intuitive way to think about this is with like a Gaussian distribution. So we can think about the area under this curve here as representing the total population. And as we see, most of the space under the curve is blue, right? And then there's a little bit of this red section, right? But the majority of it fits under this blue section. So when we add noise to something on a Gaussian distribution, we can think about centering our true value at the peak of this curve. So say we have a true value of 100 that we want to add noise to. So we'd center that right there. We can kind of choose what values we want here towards the end of the curve to decide how much noise we're adding. And then from there, we can randomly choose a value under the curve, and that would represent adding noise. And most of the time, the value is going to be in the blue section from before, right? So most of the time, we're going to get a value that's pretty close to that original value of 100. And this is like generally the intuition of what it means to add random noise on a distribution, for like just your understanding. And then we're talking about how to decide how much noise is added. And this is based on this parameter for differential privacy known as epsilon. And when we pick an epsilon value, we can think of the privacy utility trade-off we discussed before, where a higher epsilon value is going to mean higher utility and lower privacy. And we talked about that privacy guarantee that changing one person's data only changes de-identified data by a little bit dependent upon epsilon. So we're going to expand upon what that means as well. So like what that guarantee really looks like in action. So we can say we want to share information about what percentage of households are blue, right? So we have this table of data from County A, and we say, okay, there's 10 households, and the true value is that 50% of those houses are blue. So we can take this like event. We can say we want to figure out how likely it is that the reported percentage of households that are blue, the reported value that we would have would be between 45 and 55%. And we can do this for any event, or for any percentage, but I think we picked 45 to 55. So we can imagine we're a blue house, and we're saying, trying to decide whether or not we want our data to be included in this data set. So we can do that through thinking about this event, and looking at what the probabilities are of these events occurring. So how How this guarantee works is that there's a relationship between these two probabilities on the screen, between the probability that an event would occur if you include your data, and the probability that an event would occur if you did not include your data. So you can think about how much including your data is changing the outcomes. So that is related to how much privacy you have, because it represents how much your data is changing the data set. So to make this concrete, say if you didn't choose to include your data, the probability that, or if you don't choose to include your data, the probability that the value reported would be between those values is 95.95. So ignore the math, it doesn't matter. I want you to just focus on the bullet parts. So this equation, if we use an epsilon value of 0.01, so a low epsilon value, we see that these values surrounding p are very close to 0.95, right? So we see that not including or including your data is not having a large impact on the probabilities reported. However, if we use a larger epsilon value, like say 1 in the second example down here, we see that the values change a lot more. So it's 0.475 to 1.9. So we see that there's much more impact had by your data, so there's less privacy being provided. So we can understand the potential differences in the data set made by your decision, where less change represents higher privacy. So hopefully that all makes sense. Just to reiterate, differential privacy entails adding noise to make a data set private, and it provides a privacy guarantee that changing one person's data only changes the de-identified data by a little bit. So if you have this count 145 table, it could change to something like 046. Like there's small changes occurring to make it private. And when the Census Bureau announced that they were going to start using differential privacy, there was criticism from many groups across the political spectrum, ranging from the National Congress of American Indians to the state of Alabama. And there were also popular press articles in high-impact publications like the New York Times and the Associated Press. And many of these criticisms pertain to differential privacy's impact on small groups. So say we have a population with 1,000 red houses and 50 blue houses. The impact of adding noise will be much less for 1,000 than it is for 50. So we can think about if those ends are the same, it's going to have a much greater impact. The value's going to change a lot more for 50. And this is representative of the impact on small groups. The same amount of noise has a lot more impact. So generally, we're concerned about this behavior as it applies to smaller populations. And we can think about smaller populations as being like a county with few people. So, or like, I don't know, a neighborhood that only has 10 people would be like a smaller population. And then we're also concerned about it as it pertains to underrepresented groups. So we can think about a county that might be large, but only has 2 blue people. So those are the two situations where most of these criticisms draw. And we see that there's concerns with both of these mechanisms, right? So swapping, there's privacy concerns surrounding the researcher's ability to reconstruct the 2010 census data. And with differential privacy, we see there's concerns surrounding the properties of differential privacy, the way that it adds random noise, and how that will affect utility. So then we can talk about how we evaluate these concerns. So differential privacy was really the first opportunity for census data users to grapple with the fact that data was being significantly modified prior to release. So the swap rate and the swapping mechanism both had to be kept private, because if those two things were released, it would release information about the underlying data. People would be able to identify people. So though we were able to use census publications after 2020 to grasp what we talked about with swapping in the previous slides, we still don't know the exact swap rates that they use or the exact line-by-line implementation of their swapping mechanism. Differential privacy represents the first time that one of these mechanisms could be shared publicly and have the parameters shared publicly as well. So we know the Census Bureau's TDA mechanism, the differentially private mechanism, and we also know the parameters, epsilons, that they investigated. And so when we think about this criticism, we need to understand whether it draws from differential privacy being worse than swapping in some aspects, or whether it's because this is just like the first time public attention can really be paid to error from de-identification. So it's important to look at this error in context. And we're going to talk about 2 ways that that researchers have evaluated differential privacy in the census. And the first one of these methodologies, several papers have used a similar one, where they look at the impact of differential privacy on the utility of data. So several papers on here have looked at redistricting or mortality data or COVID-19 data and how use cases in those spaces are impacted. However, they do not compare to the utility of data de-identified using swapping. So the Census Bureau releases swap data. So we can think about the Census Bureau as that swapped data in the bottom right corner is the swap data that they release to the public, right? So what these papers do is they take that data on the bottom right, the swapped release data, and they use that as input for differential privacy. So they take the release data from the census, add noise to it, and then compare the output to the input of that. And to give you a little better idea, we can talk about one of the papers, we talk about the redistricting one just a little bit. So they looked at how differential privacy impacted electoral districts being drawn, and they examined whether it introduced systematic discrepancies to release statistics. And they looked at a couple different implementations that the Census Bureau released of differentially private data, one that was more private and one that was less private. And then they looked at resulting population characteristics in voting districts, and they tried to identify potential racial and partisan undercounting. And then from there, they also went through and they simulated redistricting using that data set, and they went to look and see what different kinds of things would change. And across these papers, there's largely two findings. So the first is primarily from the redistricting paper, but they see that differential privacy does not provide universal privacy protection. They say that the ability to predict race and ethnicity is no different from the 2010 data, from the swapped data. And in a moment we're going to discuss, but these results are pretty widely debated in the differential privacy community. And then the second finding across these papers, they find that the utility of differential privacy is worse than that of swapping. So they find that redistricting, for example, leads to unpredictable differences in outcomes for state-level party data, and they also see that it impacts population-level election information. So it could possibly impact the outcome of elections. And just to examine, we're going to start by examining the validity of these claims and counter-arguments from the differentially private community. So the first claim is that differential privacy doesn't provide universal privacy protection. And this was based on the fact that they were able to predict race and ethnicity of individuals in a way no different than those of 2010 data. So the differential privacy community released a statement about this, and it talks about the difference between the ability to predict based on inference versus learning. So for example, we can talk about this in the context of our house color example. So say we have this data about County A as shown on the screen, and we can say that because if we know that you're in County A, we can say that you probably have a blue house, right? Because most people in County A live in blue houses. However, this is different from the privacy attacks that can be carried out against swapping. So, for example, you can see that you have information from Experian, so you know Jane Doe's data from Experian. And you know that Jane Doe is a woman, because you have this data from Experian. So that means that you must know she lives in a red house, because there's only one female in County A, and that female lives in a red house. So these are fundamentally different kinds of privacy attacks, and the latter do not work against differential privacy. And then, yeah, I think the first one is kind of up for debate about what kind of a privacy threat that represents. The second claim was that differential privacy compared with swapping worsens the utility of census data. And the results do show this, but the results also focus on differential privacy in isolation rather than its behavior relative to swapping. So the results, we need to ask if they're really asking the right questions to address comparing mechanism utility. As these papers were comparing swapped data or the output of swapped data to differentially private data. So it doesn't mean anything to evaluate differentially private data on its own. We need to contextualize it in previous methods to understand how it compares. So this is what me and my co-authors did. So we carried out a comparative analysis of swapping and differential privacy. So we really wanted to understand how different both of the outputs of these mechanisms are compared to true data, rather than comparing their outputs out of context. So this required having access to ground truth data, which previous authors didn't have access to. Obviously, the Census Bureau didn't want to share this, so it totally makes sense. However, what's truly relevant when we think about use cases is how these mechanisms change the underlying attributes of the data. So if we look at the figure on screen, if we were to just look at like 246 and like 045 in the second column there, the private data, comparing those two values doesn't really tell us much. But if we look at the differences on screen, we can see that differential privacy and swapping in these two examples, though the outputs look very different, are having very similar underlying changes made to the data. So that's what we wanted to examine, is how those differences looked in practice. So in order to do this, we first created synthetic data. So we took published census data and used that as our ground truth data that resembles real census data because it is published census data. And we used that as our baseline. And then we ran both a differentially private mechanism on that data and a swapping mechanism on that data. So we had the original data, the swap data, and the differentially private data that we were all able to compare instead of just swapped and differentially private. And then we evaluated the privacy of that swapped data using a linkage attack. So much like the attack that we discussed earlier in the presentation, we were attempting to link back from a public outside data source to identify a sensitive attribute about someone from that table. So in our study, we guessed whether or not someone was Hispanic. And then we comparatively also evaluated the accuracy of differential privacy and swapping with metrics that focused on racial minority representation as well as the whole population. And so as far as our findings go, we saw that swapping mechanisms led to a significant risk of re-identification that disproportionately impacted minority groups. We also saw that diverse counties suffered significantly worse accuracy and privacy when compared with swapping. And then regarding accuracy, at the parameter values that were deemed reasonable through the privacy analysis, we found that the accuracy of differential privacy was equivalent to or better than swapping. And also the utility varied a lot between parameter values for swapping. So as a result, that basically just means that we learned something about the underlying mechanisms themselves in our study. So as we kind of talked about before, there's a relationship between parameter values, privacy, and utility. And in our results, we see that differential privacy, as it promises, provides a consistent, predictable relationship between privacy and utility, regardless of group diversity or size. So we have that smooth relationship we see on the screen between those variables. However, that's not the case for swapping. We see that different parameter values give vastly different results. Knowing a parameter value doesn't actually mean the same thing within a group. So if we were to change the swap rate up a little bit higher, we don't really know necessarily what that's going to mean in terms of privacy and utility in the same way that we're able to predict that for epsilon values. So this is a good argument for the use of differential privacy because it provides that predictable smooth curve. So that means we can use it more effectively. However, our paper only looked at accuracy, so it didn't look at utility for different use cases. Utility is much harder to measure, so we don't know how these mechanisms will be, or how the results of this data will be impacting different use cases. So we didn't look at how redistricting or mortality or COVID-19 data will be impacted. However, utility is much harder to measure. And just to define those terms, when we think about utility and accuracy, they're slightly different. So accuracy measures how much de-identified data resembles the original data. So we can think about a metric like mean squared error that measures the difference between the estimated value and the actual value. However, for utility, this measures how useful de-identified data is for a given use case compared with the original data. So evaluating, for example, if we have a person who is attempting to make funding decisions based upon this data. If the original data led to $3,000 of funding and the output data leads to $2,500 of funding, we can think about that as having a negative impact on, or a negative utility. Utility was negatively impacted by that change in the data. So in terms of takeaways from studies, we see that differential privacy negatively impacts utility, But it's also important to examine this error in context. We have to look at these mechanisms when they provide reasonable privacy protection, since that's the point of their use. And looking at values where they don't do that isn't really worth it. And then at these values, we see that differential privacy can provide similar, comparable, if not improved accuracy over swapping. We also see that differential privacy and swapping largely suffer from the same flaws. So smaller regions and smaller groups have less utility, or less accuracy. But differential privacy is much more consistent in this way and transparent about this behavior, whereas we're unable to understand these behaviors for swapping in the same way. Okay, so this is going to be our last section, I think the fun one. We're going to discuss what policy questions this all suggests for us and what we should be thinking about. And full transparency, before we get into this section, I just want to say that I can't tell you the right answer for any of these questions. They're subjective, and if any of you want to share your takes in this as we go along, that's great. No pressure to, but yeah, this is definitely very subjective. So one of the first questions that we can think about is what the appropriate balance between privacy and utility is. So on our privacy-utility trade-off, where we should be. And yeah, in many ways, this is really a policy question, not a technical question, although it does sound technical to say choosing an epsilon value. Because we have to determine how we want to strike a balance, and it's not normative. So saying you want to prioritize minorities isn't enough. You have to say whether it's more important to protect the privacy of minorities or to ensure the utility of data about minorities is high enough to ensure support for social programs. So there's a trade-off between those two things that you have to decide between for real-world use cases. And yeah, this isn't an easy question, and I don't really have an answer. I like to think that use case to use case this might differ, but perhaps the real answer is somewhere in the middle. But yeah, that's the first question. A second question would be who should get to make these decisions? So for the 2020 census, I can tell you how this was done. They allowed for third parties to have input into these decisions, and then they incorporated their feedback as they settled upon epsilon values for the 2020 census. So as you can see, there was like a form that people could fill out to submit their analyses and their comments about the differentially private data releases as the Census Bureau released sample data. And in terms of the stakeholders in this process, we can outline some of them here at the bottom of the screen. So there was involvement from politicians, for example, as we saw with the state of Alabama suing the Census Bureau. We can think about what their motivations are in being involved in these processes. We can think about Census Bureau scientists who helped set these parameter values and what their motivations are in doing so. We can think about census participants who are the ones who are most largely impacted by these decisions and how big of a role they played in these decisions and how big of a role they should. And then we can think about data users, so the people who use this released census data to make decisions in their organizations. And they were a pretty large part of this time around. And we can think about whether all data users are equal, or whether all use cases are equal. Should we be treating public sector data users the same as private sector data users? Should we be treating a company that's selling data to Goldman Sachs for zoning analysis the same way as government organizations who are using this data for SNAP or Medicaid decisions? There's a large range of people who benefit from the census, and we really have to think about how we can effectively make this data work for a lot of people and who should have says in doing this. Another question we can think about is when we consider inference, whether it's a privacy violation, when it's a privacy violation, I guess, and does it depend on what you're inferring. So for example, it's probably fine with this example on the board to infer that you like Bob Dylan, right? But does this become more problematic when you're inferring demographic information, or inferring the way you vote, or inferring a medical condition that you might have? There's a classic example in the differential privacy community with smoking. So whether it's a privacy violation to infer that you may have lung cancer because you smoke versus having medical records that demonstrate that you do. So like at what point does an inference become definitive? Another question we can think about is what makes data legitimate or what makes data trustworthy? And I know it's kind of a small house tonight, but I thought it would be kind of fun if any of you have any thoughts on this. You're so welcome to share them. If not, I will just keep sharing mine. It's okay, you don't have to. I won't put you guys on the spot. So these are some of the things that I came up with. Maybe we can raise your hand if we agree. How's that? Yeah? All right. So high accuracy, is that what makes data legitimate? If it reflects what we expect the real world to look like. Or utility, does it allow us to make what we view as the best decisions with our data? Or we can also think about replicability. So does it matter if data looks the same way every time? Or what about methodology? So is data legitimate or not legitimate because it adds noise, for example? Or is there another aspect of a methodology that might make data illegitimate? And then also, is the data fair? Is that something we should consider in its legitimacy? Does it give special consideration for its impact on underrepresented people? Yeah, so those are some of the things I came up with. And all in all, we have to really consider through all of those things as well, like what sources of error we're willing to accept. So it's time to acknowledge that census data is flawed and always has been, not just from de-identification, from swapping or differential privacy, but from many other sources as well. For example, only 61% of households self-responded to the 2020 census, so there's likely error in that other 39% as well. So we have to determine if de-identification is a source of error we're willing to accept, and if so, how much of it, in reference to other sources as well. Okay, so it's important to mention, again, just gonna reiterate, this entire talk has been my take. If you asked a different researcher, I'm sure they would give you an entirely different talk, potentially with different takeaways. Science is not objective, and we shouldn't treat it as such. The scientist is part of the results, and it's really important. That's why it's really important for lots of people to do research from lots of different backgrounds. And yeah, science-informed policy requires engagement from a diverse group of people. So you all should get involved if this excites you. And on that note, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the amazing people who have helped me in this line of research. Miranda Christ and Stephen Belvin, who are my wonderful co-authors on the census work. James Mickens, who's my current advisor, and Dana Boyd, who's been a wonderful resource and support system to Miranda and I during our time in this line of work. And I also want to thank the following organizations for their generous support of Science in the News. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. Can take questions at this time if anyone has any.
We actually
All right.
oh, wait, sorry. We can clap for it. Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yeah.
It's supposed to go live stream.
Is there any questions on there too?
Not yet.
Okay, cool.
So like, I don't know, I know nothing about like CS, as you know. How is noise added like consistently? Like the epsilon values, do they change depending on like how diverse the county is, or is it the same across like the whole US?
So it's dependent upon, they change the epsilon values for the different queries. So the queries are like a table of data. So every table can have an epsilon value,
Okay.
if that makes sense. But also like for differential privacy in general, like it's kind of, there's not like a standard, like differential privacy is a big area, and like I gave you like a very small scope of what differential privacy is in like the grand scheme of things. So do not take what I say and go out into the world and tell differential privacy researchers that I said it, because they will not like it.
I mean, I don't know.
No, yeah, good question though.
Sorry, here you go.
And as a reminder, if you're watching the live stream, feel free to type any questions in the chat.
So with the like 39% of people who don't respond.
Yeah.
I know from like watching election cycles and things that when people do polling, they use census data to predict who they're not polling.
Yeah.
Right, like if you call 10 people and they all respond and they're all white men in their 30s, that's gonna be, you're gonna be like, this is not representative of what the vote's going to be.
Right.
But does the census data, or does the census try to do anything to kind of mitigate the 39%? Because I could imagine that, you know, historically in different places, different groups don't respond to government censuses the same way. And
Yeah.
so are we
Yeah.
missing something just by lack of data?
Yeah, so I will say I am not an expert on that specific side of like what the Census Bureau does, so I'm not 100% sure that this is correct, but I believe that they do like actually do something to account for that 39%. Like it's not just like a you didn't answer. Whatever. Yeah.
You mentioned that there was this, I think it was Title 13, that was whatever.
Of US code, yeah,
law to, protect privacy and census data. When was that developed?
Oh, come on. Don't put me on the spot like that. I don't know. If I were to guess, I would probably guess like 80 years ago. And not like in modern times, I think. It was originally introduced because people were, I believe it was because the Census Bureau was publishing like tables of data that showed people's like assets and stuff like that, like publicly in the square, which does not sound like a modern history thing. So that's where I'm getting that number from.
I was just wondering if you mentioned the example of people being identified as Japanese descent sent off to internment camps, if
Yeah.
that was like legal under
Yeah.
this.
I'm not 100% sure if it was, to be honest, but
And then I guess also kind of related to that, was the 2010 census the first, or, the 2010 census the first to include like any kind of swapping?
no. So this has been occurring for like decades, yeah. Swapping was also used in 2000, but before that there were other methods. So they would do like suppression. So for example, if there was a data type that had less than 10,000 people, I think is the number, in the nation who have that data type, they just wouldn't release data about it. So basically, if you were in a minority group that had less than 10,000 people, good luck. So yeah, that's why these methods are really important. Even though they do negatively impact utility, like I want to believe that we are on the way up. Positive change.
Do we have any other questions? I have one other question, one that I ask pretty much everybody who talks, and that's just if you want to share anything about how you became interested in this kind of research, or even what you're working on now, anything related to that.
For sure. So I got interested in census research actually as a class project. We were just looking for something to write a research paper about for a semester course about anonymity and privacy. And we came upon some Twitter threads about this. And we were, actually it was about the National Congress of American Indians brief criticizing differential privacy. And we were like, wow, this is so interesting. And we actually started writing a paper that was essentially criticizing differential privacy. And then we did this quantitative analysis where we started comparing differential privacy and swapping about halfway into the course and realized we were completely wrong. Like, that everything we had been saying was kind of like in disagreement with these results that we got. So it was like a really cool case study in like science-informed policy and like using quantitative methods to like support like our policy paper. And also just like that you don't have to be, your initial hypothesis does not have to be right all the time, you know? So that's cool. And yeah, now I do nothing related to differential privacy. I work in systems security. So if you have any questions about that, I'm also down to talk about that if you guys want to contact me offline. You have my email? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
And as a reminder, we'll have another talk in 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving break, and that will be our 4th talk, and we'll have one more the week after that. They're on Wednesdays, same time, 7 p.m., same room, Northwest B103 on the Harvard campus, and also live streamed.
And as an additional reminder, there's cookies in the front.